Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all very much for taking time to join us as we continue our Business Power Hour. My name is Matt Metters. I'm the President and the CEO of the Greater Waco Chamber of Commerce. Some of you who have been attending the Business Power Hours are accustomed to Rick Tullis, our board chairman, kicking things off. Rick is busy with his business, and that's a really good thing. And he can't join us today, so I have the great pleasure of kicking our Business Power Hour off today and introducing our speaker to you and kind of facilitating the Q&A portion as we get towards the latter part of the presentation. And I would remind everybody that you have an opportunity to ask Sherman questions after his presentation. But today we're very, very pleased to have with us Mr. Sherman Ayres. And Sherman is making a presentation on successful leadership in times of crisis, which is certainly very applicable and timely from the standpoint of where we all are as a community and as a country and as the world, as a matter of fact. So we're so pleased, Sherman, to have you with us. I'm going to take a minute and give Sherman a bit of a proper introduction, and then we're going to go ahead and let him make his presentation. But again, I remind everyone that you have an opportunity to ask questions as we get to the end today. So please feel free to share those questions with us. I'll be monitoring the questions, and I'll make sure that we share those with Sherman. Before I introduce Sherman, let me simply express my warmest thanks to our sponsors. First National Bank of Central Texas is the presenting sponsor for our Business Power Hour series. And we have Spectrum Reach, which is our gold sponsor for our series. So our warmest thanks to those companies for their support as we continue with the Business Power Hour series. So allow me to take a moment and introduce Sherman Ayres to everyone. Sherman is the founder of Ayres Associates. He has a broad background in corporate management. Mars Inc. employed Sherman for over 30 years with corporate manufacturing responsibilities for some of their most enduring brands. He served as quality assurance manager, operations manager, and plant manager of manufacturing sites in Columbus, Ohio, Vernon, California, Albany, Georgia, and right here in beautiful Waco, Texas. In this capacity, he was responsible for all aspects of the operation, including human resources, quality, engineering, maintenance, finance, and manufacturing. Corporate management led to extensive travel across Europe, Japan, Russia, and Mexico, creating a diverse understanding of the global business community. Sherman, we're so pleased to have you here today. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you to all the chamber, Rachel, and crew for inviting me. As you can see, I'm in search of serenity like the rest of you. So I chose a serenity pool background, tranquility pool background to speak to you. I'm really humbled by the opportunity to speak and give my perspective on successful leadership in a time of crisis. And I use that word perspective very intentionally, because that's what it is. It's my perspective based on my learnings in my life experience. Now, that being said, there is a considerable school of thought to support most of the things I intend to share with you today. Now, from a transparency point of view, I want to say this to you and apologize ahead of time for how many times I'm gonna have to look down. I have an iPad in front of me with bullet points to keep me on track, because frankly, I have a lot more to say about this subject than I could ever get in the time that I have allotted. So I am going to do something that I rarely do, because I'm a much more informal person, but I will look down an awful lot while I'm talking to you to make sure I can stay on track. Because one thing I want to do is get through everything that I have thought of to share, and get to the question and answer period where I may be able to answer more specifically something that someone's thinking about that I haven't mentioned. Okay. Another thing I want to get out of the way is that you all are involuntary participants in a historically significant moment in my life. That being that this is the first time I have gone over 6 weeks without a haircut since I had to cut my hair to be able to get a hard hat on when I was 19 years old and when I started with Mars Incorporated. So that's a little bit of trivia you didn't plan on getting when I signed up for this. But I thought that was a little interesting and might bring a smile to a few people's faces that have missed going and getting their hair done or cut like I have. I've been asked to speak on successful leadership in the time of crisis. To that end, let me get one of my core beliefs out of the way. I don't or can't, I find it very difficult to distinguish between successful leadership in a time of crisis and successful leadership in a time of, quote, non-crisis. And what I mean by that is sort of like digging half a hole. One of my favorite riddles that my kids hate when I bring up is, if it takes an hour to dig a hole, how long does it take to dig a half a hole? And most children will very quickly think they have the answer and they say, well, half an hour. And you'd be surprised how many adults jump on that too. The answer to the riddle is, there's no such thing as a half a hole. You either have a hole or you don't have a hole. You have great leadership or you don't have great leadership. That's kind of my take on it. It might sound a bit whatever, but it's difficult to categorize successful leadership in a crisis versus a non-crisis situation, because there really is way too much overlap between the two, I think, to do that. Having said that, let's be clear. We all manage crisis. We have managed crisis. The level of crisis might be debatable. Crisis in our families, crisis in our jobs, crisis with our health, crisis with, you fill in the blank. So it's not a matter of whether we have managed crisis or whether we will have to manage crisis. It's part of life. It's part of what we do. But the ultimate question is managing it successfully. So I asked myself the question when I got approached about this: am I really qualified to give direction and input into successfully managing crisis while in a position of leadership? And thankfully, I can answer yes to that question. In fact, I've done it in what, without knowing the backstory, would seem like an inordinate number of times. Now, the slope when you start talking about managing crisis can get very slippery. For example, sometimes displaying great leadership in and of itself can create a crisis. And I wouldn't say that without giving an example, because it sounds kind of intuitive. And so I will give you a personal example. When I found out I was coming to Waco and that I was going to be running, at that time, arguably the largest confectionery plant in the world, and certainly the crown jewel of Mars Incorporated, I was pretty excited. But what I was thinking when I walked up the drive or the walk to go into the factory that first day probably would have surprised a lot of people, because what I was thinking was, there's no security here. I had never gone on a Mars site where I did not have to go through some kind of security to get in the parking lot. And then I walked up and walked in the door, and everyone's greeting me, and they know the new plant manager's coming, and everybody's excited. But my brain is in, so I can just walk in the front door and walk into the open office. I'm thinking security. I'm thinking associate safety. My mind is someplace totally different. So I go through the process, and the very first project I put in place, which would have been early 2000, because I came in May of '99, was a safety project, a security project. It was between $600,000 and $800,000. And it put us a gate around the property, which had not been there before. Tried to make it aesthetically pleasing, green or whatever, so it blended in. Because at that time, you could walk in the back of that factory pretty easily if that had been your choice. Put a card system in so that you had to, when you walked in, you slid each associate had to slide the card across and unlock the doors, and then you came in. Now, that was a crisis. Why was it a crisis? Because I had about 900 people very upset at this new guy that came in, and the first thing he did was wreck my routine of how I came in the morning and just walked in and went to that time clock. Now let's fast forward. Think about the time that occurred. That was early 2000. What happened in 2001? It's September 11th, okay? We all know. What happened the next day in Mars Incorporated? A memo came out for every plant to send in what their site security system looked like. And I'll give you 3 guesses who became the model for site security within Mars Incorporated. Now, I don't say that to pat myself on the back. I say that to demonstrate what I'm going to talk about a little further, which is leadership in a crisis management situation is something that has to become part of a mindset, a way of thinking about managing crisis. okay? And hopefully it's going to make sense a little more while I tell that story, okay? Now, I mentioned before that there was a backstory as to why we inordinately had to manage a lot of crises. And Matt kind of alluded to it. But when I retired from Mars, I had just finished my 9th year in operations, okay? I had spent the time at 3 different manufacturing sites, as he mentioned. 3 years as an operations manager in Vernon, California, in a pet food plant that made canned pet food. 2 years as a plant manager in Albany, Georgia, where the responsibility was to roast all those delicious peanuts that go into the Snickers bars and some of the M&M peanut products. And 4 years as the plant manager here in the Waco plant. That's 9 years out of 31. So what about the other 22? Well, the first 22 years of my Mars journey were spent in the quality management area, which is a division of R&D. And in quality management, every day is about managing crisis. That's the whole concept of managing food safety, okay, is to avoid things like the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario in the pet food side of the business, for example, was ever having a complaint come from the FDA or from a customer that they fed their animal Whiskas, Pedigree, Sheba, Caesar, any of the Mars Pet Care products, and had an illness or worse occur as a result of that. And in the case of confectionery products, we're standing between making sure that when you bite into a Snickers bar, the only thing that you get is that crunch from those peanuts, okay? And that delicious bite, that snap that we talked about as a part of that product experience. In the M&Ms, we want you to open that pouch and pour M&Ms in your hand and nothing else comes out but M&Ms. Now, there are people who get paid to make those M&Ms, and there are people who get paid to think about how we make sure we never have a crisis of an issue with any of those products. We decided to use a process called HACCP, and that's where I'm going to try to tie into just the leadership experience in a crisis situation. HACCP was a food safety process that stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points that was put into the food management systems in North America, certainly, in the late 70s, early 80s, and it still stands to this day in some form. And what it basically says is that there are steps that you can do to avoid having what the food industry would call a crisis. And what I want to do is draw an analogy between thinking about it, managing crisis successfully in a leadership position in today's environment or any environment, whether you work in a bank, whether you're in an attorney's office, whether you're an entrepreneur, regardless, the same principles of managing a crisis successfully when you are in that leadership position apply. Now, quickly, I want to go through the steps. The first is you have a hazard analysis. What are the hazards we're trying to manage? Second is you identify the critical control points in the process. Third, you establish control limits against those. Fourth, you measure and monitor against those control limits. Fifth, you establish corrective actions if you come outside of those control limits. Sixth, you verify against the corrective actions that you put in place to monitor the control limits that you put in place to manage the critical control points that you put in place to manage the crisis. It's a rechecking. And finally, it's record keeping. Now, in the food side, it's easy. The easiest example to use on that would be foreign material. There's a lot of hazards in the process, but the one of keeping things out of the package or the can or whatever is an easy one to visualize. So if that is your hazard you're trying to manage, what are the critical control points? That means you have to have something that controls what the vendor sends to you as components, because most of the things that are made of components that come from someplace else. There have to be checks and balances, okay? There have to be internal things like metal detectors, non-ferrous detectors. If you're in a cannery, how do you make sure there's nothing in the can before you put whatever you're going to put in that can? When the can goes into the seamer or the filler to get filled, they get turned upside down. They get air blown in. There's things that you do to control those critical control points, okay? There's also another aspect of managing crisis, which is designing it out. The best example I can give you for that is if you go in a food plant that really is serious about it, no one will have pockets on their shirts. And women that don't wear shirts will wear smocks and the pockets will be down on the very bottom. That's designing out a hazard. If you have pockets, people put things in pockets. If you can put things in pockets, they can fall out of pockets. So rather than trying to control that hazard, that hazard, and say, just don't put things in your pockets, you just remove the pockets. Another great example of eliminating a hazard crisis is locker rooms. When you go in locker rooms in food facilities, in most times, you'll see that all the lockers are pointed on top like this. Because if you have a flat top on a locker, that says put something up there, okay? So that's just a good manufacturing practice, but it's an example of designing out a hazard. So the best case is always to be able to design it out. Next, you have to put quality checks in and audits against the things you put in place. Then you have to put corrective actions in place. What if I do find something that's out of control? What is the corrective action, okay? Then you have to verify the effectiveness of those corrective actions. Okay. I don't have time to go into all the details, but you kind of hopefully can visualize that. And at the end of the day, you have to have great record keeping. And in that line of work, and as in most lines of work, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. You know, you wouldn't want to hold your breath until you go to a regulatory person and they say, well, did you do this? Yes. Well, where's the record of it? Well, trust me. So obviously we know that doesn't happen. Now, let's flip the script and try to apply those same things to the thinking of ensuring successful leadership in a time of crisis, okay? What would be the hazard that we're trying to avoid? We're trying to avoid, in step one in the hazard analysis, a crisis management failure, okay? Successful leadership in a crisis is one side of the coin. The other side, the opposite, is unsuccessful management of a crisis. So a crisis management failure is the hazard that we're trying to manage to ensure successful leadership in a crisis situation. Okay, what type of things could cause a crisis management failure? What are the critical control points? And from a micro level, they could be anything from communication, lack of proper technical resources, all that type of thing. But at the top level, the thing that causes a failure in a crisis situation from a leadership position is a lack of preparedness. That is the critical control point that we want to control in a crisis situation. Lack of preparedness is the enemy. Number three, establish control limits. What are the control limits in this scenario that we're talking about? The control limit in this situation to avoid having a failure of leadership in a crisis situation is to establish and professionally train a crisis management team. A crisis management team in place is the best thing that a leader can do to put in place to avoid being ill-prepared to manage a crisis situation, regardless of your discipline. Number four, in the HACCP terminology, monitor control limits. What does that look like in this scenario? That means formally reschedule training sessions for preparedness with your crisis management team. It's not enough to put the team in place. Every 18 months to 2 years, you need to retrain, go back in and see how effective and what is the state of readiness that you are in the event that a crisis comes. Now, crisis management is sort of like, I have a great friend who retired from the State Highway Patrol in Ohio and never had to pull his gun, okay? You never want to have to go through a crisis. You don't plan to have a crisis. You plan that in the event that you do have a crisis, you're ready, okay? So you could go your whole career and never have, quote, what you might consider to be a catastrophic crisis, which means basically could take your business out, okay? But a crisis management team, which is made up of a leader, an external relation person, an internal relation person, a technical support person, a person that has a job to do record keeping. These are specific roles that are independent of the roles that the individuals have in their normal jobs, okay? And it's very important that each one of those things work the way they're supposed to work. Verification of the corrective actions. Now, what would be a corrective action in that kind of scenario? An example, the team comes in, they train. And when I say train, I'm talking about they send a scenario that you have to be prepared for maybe 48 to 72 hours ahead of time. So you don't get much time. This group comes in and you have to go through how your team has managed it or would manage it by each role. And at the end of your set, and that includes at a point where the external relation person, for example, will have to walk in a room that's set up just like a press conference. And when you walk through that door, there's cameras in your face, it's videotape. You get asked all the worst questions that you think you could ever get asked in that kind of situation. And it really is a trial. It is not a fun thing to go through necessarily. It's about as fun as catching the flu, as they say. But when you get done, the team feeds back to the leader who is responsible for this crisis management that everything went fine, but maybe the person you have doing the external relations part of your crisis management training, we're not sure that that's the right individual. We saw some things here. Okay, so from the leadership position, I have two things to decide. Is that a control point that I can improve and put something in place, meaning some kind of developmental training, some kind of other things that could be done to help this individual get to where the next time they come in and watch, they can say, hey, I can see the difference. You know, I think you're fine. Or do I have to take the pockets off the shirt? Do I have to design out that issue, replace that person with another person who is better suited to do that role and therefore strengthen the team? That's a situation that applies whether you're dealing with people or you're dealing with an inanimate process. Verification of the effectiveness of the corrective action would then, in that case, come in when the team came back for retraining. I meet with them as a leader and say, hey, we decided to keep that individual in the external relations role, but these are the things we did to try to bolster the weaknesses that you defined for us. Let us know how it went, what you think after the session. And if you've gotten it right, the answer will be, hey, we don't know what you did. Give this person a pat on the back because they really stepped up and we can see that they took this seriously and they're doing a great job, okay? Or if it's a person that I had to decide that I wanted to remove the hazard, so to speak, how did this new person do? So the point I'm trying to make is that in my world and the way I have approached managing crisis, I have had a blueprint from another form of managing crisis that I have found to be very useful in managing non food safety related type situations, because the discipline is really in how you think about managing a crisis, okay? So there's some things I want to say to you as I wrap this up. In the midst of a crisis, you don't want to have to think too much. What I mean by that is you want things that to occur almost like through a reflex, okay? That's difficult because doing the training and doing the type of thing I'm talking about to get to that point, it takes time and it takes a commitment. And unfortunately, in most organizations, particularly those that are having to meet the needs of stockholders and the like, whenever budgets get cut, the first thing that generally gets cut is training, okay? And somebody out there is nodding when I say that. I can't see you, but that's just the way of the world. And it's not so much that it's training, it's such that it's because things like training are hard to measure the success or failure or the value to money equation of training. However, when you're talking about crisis management training, I'm not sure that applies, because if you don't have any training in place when a crisis hits, I really don't see how you could be successful, in some ways even remotely successful, because it takes a very dedicated and focused type of approach to manage crisis. another thing I want to say to you is the last thing you want to be doing in a crisis is worrying about how to manage it. If that's the case, then you've got two crises. You've got the crisis you're trying to manage, and you've got the fact that you're trying to manage it and aren't comfortable with that piece of it. So it's a very, very difficult situation at times. And I can tell you that having gone through and growing up kind of in that kind of a world and thinking of managing crisis as part of my job, when you watch someone on television who is the spokesperson for crisis management, you can tell immediately whether or not that person has gone to any kind of crisis management training, because there are some do's and there are some don'ts. Okay, and we don't have time to get into all of those. So, lastly, I will close with this, and hopefully there's some questions, and hopefully the analogies that I tried to make sense to you. If I had to sum up concisely my approach to managing crisis through a career that in many ways was rooted in crisis management, I would put it this way. And I'm going to read this because I want to get it. I spent a lot of time trying to make sure I had the words I wanted to say. Create a strong team environment built on a foundation of competency, trust, teamwork, performance management, and egalitarianism. And with that as your everyday mission, when crisis comes, you will be prepared for the unexpected, which in many ways is the key to successful leadership in a time of crisis. So that's what I have to share with you today. I'm ready to open up the floor for questions or comments or feedback.
Sherman, thank you very much for that presentation. The last portion of your presentation, I think, is particularly applicable to our small business community. Unfortunately, I think a lot of our small businesses did not have a crisis management plan in place. And that's probably very common for the small business community. We didn't have a crisis management plan in place. We put one in place as we realized we were moving into crisis. So I would ask you, as our small business community, and part of our small business community has been open throughout the entire period, deemed essential part of our economy, if you will, but we're beginning to open up the balance of our economy now. And for those small business men and women out there who are now opening up their retail establishments, your wife has a retail establishment, as they reflect on the guidance that you provided them, what counsel would you give to them, to a small 12, 13 person shop retailer that's now opening up their doors, and they've been through this crisis? They've been incredibly concerned about navigating these tough challenges and keeping their business as viable as possible. They're bringing back in their employees, they're bringing back in their customers. What's your counsel to them as they try to manage all of these moving pieces, and as they're also receiving guidance from the state of Texas related to reopening as it relates to COVID-19?
Well, first of all, there's no one size fits all, okay? And we know that intuitively. But if you've heard my approach that I'm talking about today, and there's other approaches, I think that thinking about your business, not necessarily by how large or small it is, but by just thinking about it in a very regimented way, okay? And that's why I tried to keep talking about it's an approach to how you think about these things. Now, one good thing that's happened is, although a lot of people fall in the category of what you said, Matt, about not having any kind of crisis management plan in place, I would venture to say that after this event, that number is going to be dramatically smaller, because now everybody knows that it can happen. You know, in the food safety world, it doesn't take a genius to figure out, hey, the one thing that can cost me a $900 million brand is if I end up on 60 Minutes and people have found a warehouse full of bad candy bars, okay? So it's easy to know that you need to have a crisis management plan in place for something like that. if you have a very small business, until you have something like this outside influence bring it to your attention, it's not something that you would think about. So that's natural. But now I think I'd be hard pressed to have anybody, regardless of this business size, not be thinking about how can I be prepared if this happens the next time? What do I have to do this time around? It's simple things. It's, for example, if you have a business where in this environment right now, but we know what the hazard is. The hazard is the virus. Okay. If the grocery stores, for example, didn't already have doors that opened up when you went into them, and they were normally closed doors, you would start with, what's the first hazard I need to, so you could do, I can control the hazard by every time somebody walks in there, I have them wash their hands, and I wipe off the handles of the door every time they go through. Or I could design out the hazard and just keep the doors open, okay? And it really is that simple. You have to, and you may be in a creative kind of environment where that's not your thing to think about things so black and white. But my contention to you would be, when you're talking about managing a crisis, you have to force yourself to think about things that way, because we're not naturally intuitively going to do that. So my counsel would be, back up, look at your business from a step-by-step, try to think. And that's why I always struggle, Matt, with coming off like sounding like a guy that's saying I'm a half-empty guy. If I'm walking around worrying about crisis, I'm a doom and gloom guy. Think about it as the glass half full. Think about it however you want to think about it. But at the end of the day, you got to be prepared for if that one thing that probably will never happen happens.
Thank you, Sherman. How do you keep your staff engaged during a crisis, and what support should you provide to them?
Well, I'm going to go back to this again. Maybe before our current crisis, we could claim ignorance. We can't claim ignorance anymore. And I would suggest to you that regardless if a staff is 8 or 10 people, or if a staff is 2 people, or your staff is 1 person, you need to have a mindset of how do we manage a crisis? Because see, if you're prepared for it, you know, when you say how do you manage your staff through a crisis? Well, that's the point I'm making. If you have to worry about how you're going to do it when the crisis hits, you're not going to be able to do it. You have to take time, and I think there's no better time than once we get back into whatever the new normal is in our own environments, and sitting down and saying, hey, we're back, but we need to think about what we've just gone through, what we do in the event that something like this happens again, because similarity and you know, the unexpected creates tension, creates stress, it creates all the things that work against you in the time of crisis. The best case scenario is you have a situation where you can send out an email or a text to quote your staff and say, we have a crisis, we need to meet you know, in the conference or whatever we designated. You know, why do people do fire drills? Why do you go through fire drills in school when you're a little kid? Why do they do it in businesses? So that when that bell rings, nobody has to say, where do I need to go? Okay, that's why you have fire drills. And it's the same way with managing crisis. You have to go into the what if game and say, well, what if this happens? Now, you always have that person who'll say, well, why are we practicing for something? I mean, the odds of that happening are slim and none. Okay. Well, how many of us would have thought we'd be in a situation where, you know, 20 or 30 years from now, we're going to be sitting back with people who are going to be saying, wait a minute, there was a time when you couldn't go get a haircut. There was a time when you couldn't leave your house. You know, so I say that you have to really change how you think about crisis management, because most of us, frankly, never think about this kind of thing. Why would you? You know, when I tell people that I worked in a factory that had 7 canning lines, 3 of them were running little 6-ounce cans of cat food, 2 of them were running large cans of dog food, and the other were running the jumbo cans, and the 3 that were running the flat cans were running 900 cans a minute. So you're talking about 9 times 3, you're talking about, you know, 2,700 cans a minute. 24 hours a day. And people would look at me and say, oh, wait a minute. How many dogs and cats are there out there? I never thought about that. And that's it. Why would you think about that if it's not your job to make pet food? Okay. So why would you think about crisis management if you don't have a crisis, have never had a crisis, and are not going to anticipate having a crisis? That's the leap that you have to make. You have to anticipate that what could go wrong in my business. And again, who has the time in our busy lives to stop and spend focused time on something that's non-existent? It's a difficult thing.
Yes.
It takes a commitment.
Sherman, we've exhausted our questions. I sure appreciate your time today. Do you have any closing comments you'd like to share with our audience?
I just hope that I hope that it made sense what I'm saying. I really do. And you, all of you may not be able to or be in a position to quote hire somebody to help with crisis. Read up on it. You can Google and YouTube just about anything. But don't let yourself be unprepared. You know what successful leadership in a crisis looks like? Unsuccessful leadership in a crisis, typically the major cause of that will be a lack of preparedness. And if you prepare yourself for something that may never happen, but when it does, you'll be in control. I think that it'll make all of us sleep a little easier at night.
Sherman, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. We really appreciate your guidance and your input. Folks, I'd like to express my warmest thanks to you all for joining us as we continued our Business Power Hour gatherings. Share with you that next week on Tuesday the 19th at 11 o'clock in the morning, we have Nathan McCrae, who is going to be presenting on advertising in adverse times. Nathan is with Spectrum Reach. And I'd like to close by once again expressing my warmest thanks to our sponsors, First National Bank of Central Texas, our presenting sponsor, and Spectrum Reach, our gold sponsor, and then close by thanking all of you again for joining us today. We're here for you. We appreciate your support of your Chamber of Commerce. If you need us, please call. Thank you. Sherman, thank you.
Thank you.